Well, thank you. Yes, I hail from the southern part of the state, and I know for most of you, if you're from around here, you know that that's a whole different world than up here in the beautiful part of the state in North Idaho. I thought I'd start out. The title of my talk is 16,000 Hours, and so I was told by a friend of mine yesterday that apparently that's the number of hours you have to work to, or amount of hours you need to work to be an electrician in the state of Minnesota. So what the number really is the amount of time that a student spends in school, K-12. So the 16,000 Hour Story was the original title of Battle for the American Mind. As all publishers do, they changed the title, and I think they came up with a better one. The story of the book, I'm going to start with the end of the story and then we'll work forward a little bit. So I don't know if many of you have heard of the book, Battle for the American Mind. It was a co-authored book between myself and Pete Hegseth, Fox News. I'll talk in a minute about how it came about, but I will say that it surprised pretty much everyone in that education books usually don't rise up onto the New York Times bestseller list. In the last year in June, we were readying for its release. I was doing a few Fox pieces. Of course, Pete is on Fox a lot, so he was doing some. And I saw, or I was informed by HarperCollins that it was going to end up in Costco. And I figured that now we've made it. I mean, I don't care about the New York Times, but Costco, no. But when it released, it went quickly to #1 on the New York Times list, stayed there for about 4 weeks, and then stayed on the list for the rest of the summer. And the strange thing about that is it surprised everyone. It surprised Pete, who'd written other books. Surprised, of course, I was along for the ride. I was just kind of the technical advisor on a documentary that we had done. And the story really began with a phone call I got from Pete in 2020, just before the COVID hit. And so I'm going to tell this part of the story because it's going to become very obvious that the book's success was far more providential than anything that we had planned. It's a book on education. Books on education don't do as well as this book had done. But as you know, in January, February of 2020, it was like life before the storm. We had no idea what was going to be coming in the next couple of years. So I got a call on an afternoon from a gentleman you guys might know, Gene Lichty, some of you may know, and he had connected me with Pete, so Pete and I had a phone call. And Pete's question, he had met somebody who was at a classical Christian school. He had some kind of loose understanding of what it was, but he wanted to do some publicity work at Fox on how to create a patriotic form of education that we could replace the public school system with. So he was told that I could help him with that. And the first thing I told him was, actually, that was the problem, is that we tried to create a patriotic education. And I'll tell you that story. So I told him the story, which I'm about to tell you, and it was like, it blew his mind. He'd never even thought about the fact that Christianity sustained civilization. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the first thing I told him that kind of put him back on his heels, he asked the narrative most people have about American public education is that American education was great. It was this great thing up until 1960 when the court took prayer out of the schools and everything went downhill from there. So that was the narrative that Pete relayed to me. He said, actually, it happened much earlier than that. The entire public education system was built by a group of people who wanted not to indoctrinate your kids at first, but they wanted to take something out of the school system that had been there for 2 millennia. And it had nurtured Western civilization. And it's called the Western Christian Paideia. That's what we call it, in the book anyways. And this Western Christian Paideia was in the way of the aspirations of the progressives. So When I told him that, he was curious because you're telling me, what was this thing, this paideia? It's not a word anybody's heard. What was this thing that they removed from education? Paideia is a very old concept, a very big concept. I don't really have time to go into it in this story, but it essentially forms the way in which the culture is. The Greeks figured out that culture was made. It wasn't just natural. It was created, and it was created through the education of children in some very particular ways. And so the Greeks intentionally developed a form of paideia that eventually became the Western Christian paideia. So that's all I'll say about paideia right now. We'll come back to it in a moment. But the problem is that it's such a powerful force that the progressives could not get control of this country without undermining the American or the Western Christian paideia. So who were the progressives? In the late part of the 19th century, this interesting group formed up. So many of you know that socialism in Europe and particularly in Russia had developed into communism and some other things, and it just wasn't working in America. Anarchists and communists were trying to get a foothold even in the late 1800s. And things that people don't realize sometimes, McKinley, the president, was assassinated by an anarchist who was trying to bring about a communist revolution. So it's that early in the system that communism was failing in the United States. So progressivism formed, and it's an interesting amalgam of three groups. It's an amalgamation of three groups. One were the atheistic socialists, but they were relatively small in number. And those guys like John Dewey, Charles Potter, some that we'll talk about in a moment, those guys were atheists, they were humanists, they were socialists, they wanted to transform America into something else, but they didn't have the numbers. So they allied with two other groups. One were the social gospelist mainline Christian denominations. And those groups, headed initially by a gentleman named Washington Gladden, or at least he was considered the father of the social gospel, brought in social justice as a whole function of the discussion around progressives. So you have atheistic humanism, liberal Christianity, and then the third lobe, which I think is probably the most powerful of them. Teddy Roosevelt's the best character you can look to see this, and it's because Teddy Roosevelt did a lot of good things, and we like him generally, but what he kind of represented was this idea of manifest destiny. You've probably all heard of that, but this idea that America itself was salvific. It didn't depend on Christ. In itself, it was a salvific movement. And so you take this idea that we can progress America to save the world, not to further the cause of Christ, but America itself is going to save the world. And you meld in the social gospel and the atheistic humanists, and you get progressives. So that group formed up, and by 1905 to 1915, they pretty much dominated, that was the area or the sphere in which America began to shift away from the Western Christian paideia towards something that we call the American progressive paideia in the book. And the American progressive paideia is what you think of if you watch shows like, shows from the 1950s, or even It's a Wonderful Life, where you see the high schools with, romance and football teams and all of the wonderful things that the public high school in America was kind of given to the lore of America. That whole concept was built by the progressives. And it surprised me when I began my research originally just how much the progressives were set on this. So the two publications I read most to write the book were The New Republic, which was their biggest and primary publication, and The Progressive, which started out as another work. But both of them we're gonna hear from them as we go through the story here. But one of the things to note is that education was regularly talked about. Now, if you went to public school like I did, and you remember the little green box on the side of the book, your textbook in high school, that said the progressives on the top, and it told you what they were, they credit them with ending child labor. They credit them with the minimum wage. They credit them with the 8-hour workday. So they're kind of the heroes of progressive, of modern social science textbooks, if you will. And the reason for that is, of course, the guys who write them are progressives, so they tell a story in which they're the heroes. That's not surprising. So between about 1915 and 1940, the progressives decided the way to take over America was to seize control of the education system. Now, when the HarperCollins editor originally read my manuscript, he just read one chapter of it, and his concern on the call with Pete and I was he didn't want to publish another conspiracy theory. And I said, well, there's no conspiracy here. This is a war on open field. They wrote about it in all their books. This wasn't hidden. It was just, we're going to take control, and here's how we're going to do it. And so I'll take us through that right now. So basically their strategy was dismantle and replace. But one of the problems with dismantling things, especially things that people really like, is that, so the WCP had been depended on for a long time in the schools. We studied the catechisms, the scriptures, all of that was so built into the fabric of school that if they had taken that thing, that Western Christian paideia, and put it off to the side, people would go, hey, that's no good. So you gotta kind of think of this like one of those sort of heist movies where there's a treasure on a pressure plate and the thief wants to take it, but he can't take it unless he replaces it with something about of equal weight. What they replaced the Western Christian paideia with was American sort of a worship of America. And so they took a good thing, America, and they stuck it there as the God of our educational system. So I'm going to read this quote from the progressives as they were writing in an open magazine that was published to everyone what they were going to do. This is about 1915. The older theories of democracy were negative, built up to protest against kings, aristocracies, and oppression. Those theories were concerned chiefly in saying what the government must not do. So far, so good. 20th century democracy, so you see they're capturing the word that to Americans was a very important and valuable thing, democracy. They're redefining it. 20th century democracy believes that the community has certain positive ends to achieve, and if they are to be achieved, the community must control the education of the young. It believes that training in scientific habits of the mind is fundamental to the progress of democracy. It believes that freedom and tolerance mean the development of independent powers of judgment in the young, not the freedom of older people, aka parents, to impose their dogmas on the young. Democracy claims no right to interfere with worship or opinion, but it does claim the right to develop in every child the capacity for testing its own convictions. It insists that the plasticity of the child shall not be artificially and prematurely hardened into a philosophy of life, but that experimental naturalistic aptitudes shall constitute the true education. When I first read this quote, the word plasticity jumped off the page at me. I didn't know what plasticity meant or what meant in that context, but I did know, I'd heard of this thing called paideia from one of Doug's books written way back in the 90s. So I started to look into that and figure out what is the alignment between this plasticity that they were talking about in 1915 and paideia. So I started to pull on the thread to figure out where this came from. And what I started to see happening was that the progressives were replacing, and that's the key to this story, they started slowly replacing every element of Christianity in our culture with atheistic humanism. So the first thing they did was to replace the telos. If you know, the term telos, of course, is the ultimate purpose of education. So I'll read a quick quote here on how they chose to replace the purpose. Because if you're going to replace something, the first thing you need to do is say, we're not going there, we're going here. So this is the new educational purpose. It is our present classical Christian education, which is highly specialized. This is John Dewey, by the way. It is our present classical Christian education, which is highly specialized, one-sided, and narrow. It is an education dominated almost entirely by the medieval concept of learning. It is something which appeals, for the most part, simply to the intellectual aspect of our natures, our desire to learn, to accumulate information, and to get control of the symbols of learning. I think that's a fairly good definition, actually. But it's not to our impulses and tendencies to make, to do, to create, and to produce. And so Dewey targeted classical education because it didn't produce anything, at least not in the way of material goods. He wanted to create a United States where all the students were servile. They served the state and they served the economy. So that was Dewey's intended telos. Now, of course, C.S. Lewis later said this of that idea. You see at once in that education is essentially for free men and vocational training for slaves. If education is beaten by training, civilization dies. So one of the reasons I think that the book did so well is that it doesn't take long for just about anybody with clear eyes to look around and say our civilization is dying. It is in its final death throes, or at least it's in the beginning of the death throes. It's hard to say how bad things could get, but it's certainly crazy right now. And when Pete and the guys at Fox decided to do the documentary, and I did this interview for them and I explained this to them, it was like, this is scary, because what you're telling us is this is not going to be reversible. And sadly, that's about what I was telling them. So the second thing, we're going through the things that they replaced. The second thing that the progressives replaced were the creeds and icons of the church. So what you would have seen in a mid-19th century school, of course, was not an American flag. It was a cross. And what you would see there was not the Pledge of Allegiance, it was the Apostles' Creed. So as they began to replace things, we can kind of see the attitude that they took, the progressives took, through, here's a quote by Dallas Lore Sharp. Now he's one of those, remember I said there were three groups in the progressives? He's in the mainline denomination social gospel side of things. He's actually a pastor. And this is what he says. The American public school is as truly national as the American flag. Do you see how the equation of the salvific nature of America itself is put in here? It's truly as national as the American flag. We send our American children by the tens of thousands to church and private schools, named with old names, not with the new name of our nation, schools which looked back into a dim, dead past, not out upon a living present. And we expect these old world schools to make new world minds. Do men expect to gather figs from thistles? He continues, my child is first a national child. And we've heard this recently, that the children don't belong to their parents, they belong to the nation. Well, this quote is from the 1920s, so they've been on this for a long time. My child is first a national child. He belongs to the nation even before he belongs to himself. His education is first national and after that personal. We parents can hardly see this. It is a particularly difficult point of view for the highly individualized, assertive Anglo-Saxon whose political weakness is his undeveloped sense of social solidarity. So you can see how they're spinning things to make them work in the 1920s when the Western Christian Paideia is still there. One of the things that was replaced, and this is one that if you see the book or even the documentary on Fox is called The Miseducation of America, and the producers did a really good job of finding video of this. It's really quite amazing. Francis Bellamy wrote this pledge that was used in most all-American schools from about 1880 until 1942, and you'll hear why in a moment. It changed. But this is the pledge. See if it sounds familiar. I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation invisible with liberty and justice for all. Sounds very close to the pledge that we still do, right? Well, that pledge was said with the child's hand outstretched like this. So obviously 1942 it had to go, but it had those nationalistic constructs in it that it was trying to make the children first children of the nation as opposed to of the church and the family. So the next thing they went to replace, the progressives, were the catechisms. Yes, the catechisms were in the church, in the schools prior to 1890s roughly. So they figured this out kind of through a back door by a gal named Frances Willard. So as you know, alcohol and the temperance was a big hot button issue among the progressive set at the end of the 19th century, 1870s, 1880s. They'd been trying to take alcohol out of society for a long time. They weren't getting anywhere. So she decided that there was this new thing called, in around 1875, the common school system. And the curriculum for these school systems was state mandated. So she could go around and get a state mandated curriculum on alcohol into the 3rd grade class of every school in the vast majority of the voting America, which would have been at the time in the upper Northeast and across into the Midwest. She could do that. She might be able to finally crack this nut of getting temperance laws put into place because they hadn't been able to get them. So she did that, put this curriculum in place, which has long since by all parties been recognized to be fraudulent because it said a lot of things about alcohol that weren't true, et cetera, et cetera. That was 1875. One generation later, you pass not just a law, but a constitutional amendment to forbid alcohol anywhere in the country. The power that the progressives realized that they had is what I believe motivated their intense search for control of the American public school system. They unified the curriculum then after that across the states. They replaced history and literature with things like social studies. They removed the Christian content in larger cities. In a lot of the smaller cities, it wasn't until the late 60s that got removed, but in the big cities, it was gone earlier. So that's how they replaced the catechisms of the church with the doctrines of whatever progressive curriculum they wanted to put through. The next thing they did was replace liturgy in the school. So to do this, they knew they needed a model school. So a lot of people, if you read anything about somebody in the 1800s, they probably had an 8th grade education. Well, that's because high schools didn't really exist. All you had were, if you went past the 8th grade, it was a college preparatory kind of private school that carried you. So they wanted to put high schools in every state, and they needed a model for this. And so in 1905, a new town was built in Indiana called Gary, Indiana. And they had the opportunity, since the town was built from the ground up for a steel, I think it was a steel operation. They built one of Dewey's proteges who had studied with him in Minnesota, took over and created the Gary School in Indiana, and it was a model school for the progressives. It's called the Gary Plan. And the Gary Plan is what gave us things like having 7 separate periods in a high school, bells that go off between the periods. Before 1915, this was never done. It was new. 30 desks facing forward, a chalkboard with a picture of the president, John Dewey, and a flag above it. All of that came from Gary, roughly. I mean, some pieces were borrowed from here and there, But at bottom, they built the model school in Gary, Indiana. Now, as an aside, one of the interesting details is the school building that they built still exists in Gary, Indiana. And the interesting thing about it is that it is now so violent in that area that you can't get to it. We wanted to film there with Fox, and Fox couldn't find a security team to take us in there. So I guess that's a metaphor for what eventually came out of this Gary, Indiana experiment. But what it essentially did was establish the way to take religion out of the public schools. So I'm going to read a little bit of the debate that took place in the New Republic on this point. Creed consciousness, that they're speaking of a debate between two progressives on this religious piece. They said creed consciousness will be revived if we allow the Gary Plan back into New York City. And religious feeling, which had been banished from our American schools in New York, will be brought back in perilous form. To which the promoters of the Gary Plan responded, as long as the public school is in any sort of competition with a church school, religion will not be entirely divorced from the schools. So in other words, they wanted to separate religion from schools so they could create a new paideia without religion. And if they removed Christianity outright, parents would flee to the private schools. They go on to say the church school will be less necessary for those who wish religious instruction for their children. What the Gary Plan seems to do is not to bring religion into the schools, but for the first time to take it out of the schools. So what we see is they've slowly replaced all the aspects of the Western Christian paideia by replacing elements of the school system until they completely controlled it. And once they controlled it, they decided that they needed to eliminate any competition. So in 1918, the last school, the last state that did not make education mandatory, Mississippi, passed a compulsory education law, which is what caused everyone to have to put their kids either in a public school or private school. Most people couldn't afford private schools, so they went to the public. But there were still some people in the private schools. And in Oregon, the governor in I think it was the late 1918s, passed a law that private schools were illegal. And there was a Supreme Court case that went up and reversed that decision in 1922 called Pierce versus Society of Sisters. But that's how close we were to the country making parent-run education illegal. So in 1909, I'm just going to recap here really quick this progressive action, then I'm going to talk a little bit about the three things we can do in the classical Christian world to counter this, or three of the things. In 1909, in the Progressive magazine, it started out with this call: the battle is just on, it's young yet, it will be the longest and hardest ever fought for democracy. Remember how they use that word, democracy. In other lands, the people have lost. Here, we shall win. Today, I think we've seen them win, if you look at what has happened to our society. Charles Potter, who co-signed the Humanist Manifesto with John Dewey, said this in 1933: what can theistic Sunday school meeting for an hour once a week do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching? Well, they knew what they were doing. So when I'd read all this, I thought, this is a little too obvious. Somebody must have written about this. And it turns out a Columbia professor who was quite well known, won a Pulitzer Prize for his work, his name's Lawrence Kremen, wrote this describing what the progressives did in the early part of the 20th century. He said, if education was to be the principal engine of an intentionally progressive society, then the politics of education would have significance far beyond the control of schools or child-saving institutions or communication organizations. In the end, it would hold the key to the achievement of the most fundamental of political aspirations. In effect, the key to the American paideia. So he recognized that term and used it. What I would say is that we are now in the wreckage left over. The American progressive paideia held on in American schools until probably the 1980s. And then it started to shift over, and I figured that the cultural Marxist paideia dominated the educational institutions by the late 90s into the 2000s. And now what we're seeing in our country is really just a reflection of a cultural Marxist paideia that has been fostered in our children. So the question for today, I think, is what can we do given this, right? The first thing you should do in any war, any culture war, is do your reconnaissance. Look back in history, see how they took over, look at what they're trying to do, and look at how to counter that. Pete wrote the part of the book at the end on an insurgency because he was a counterinsurgency officer in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. And so he said, we're too far gone to be able to change this at the national level. So he turned away from his idea of fixing the public school system and said, we've got to do it in small insurgent groups, which is what you all, I think, are. And with that, classical Christian education is our instrument, it is our tool, it is our weapon in one context, which is how we raise our kids. Now, I said 16,000 hours are presented for us to use in the education of our children. I'll go into that in a moment, but I wanted to just touch on three things because classical education is such a big bucket, it's very unlikely I could possibly explain it quickly. So I'm just going to do one from what we call the grammar phase, and one from the middle school or the logic phase, and one from the rhetoric phase, just to give you a little touch of how we can change this for our kids. So the first one, in grammar school, I think the most important thing you can do is stimulate and foster the moral imagination of your kids. This is typically done through stories. Now, when I say the words moral imagination, a lot of people go, those words don't go together. Imagination is something you do with crayons, you know, drawing pictures of clouds or something. So we have to think about what imagination is first. Imagination is simply looking at what's out there and imagining something that isn't experienced. So imagining something that isn't experienced. When you look at imagining beauty, so the three transcendents, truth, goodness, and beauty, we'll go through those really quickly here. If you're talking about how do you imagine beauty, that's easy, right? You put your kids out on the lawn and let them look at the clouds and find dragons. That's already natural. Imagining truth, that's also pretty it's practiced regularly. We learn by theorizing. We theorize what might be true, and then we look at scripture and other sources to come up with an imagined truth. The imagining goodness is the hard part, right? That's the one that's really hard to get through. So with your kids, that's what the moral imagination is. It's imagining what something good looks like. What does goodness look like? C.S. Lewis talks about this a lot in terms of fairy stories, because those types of stories are stories that allow pure characters with pure forms of goodness to be experienced in a mythical way that shapes and forms the way our children see the world. And so I think sometimes I talk a little bit about what Disney has done to these fairy stories. One that I can briefly touch on is Pinocchio. Don't let your kids watch the Disney form of Pinocchio, at least not until they've read the book several times, because the book is entirely different. What is it that we all think of with Pinocchio? What's the moral of the story? If you lie, your nose grows, right? Totally Disney. It's actually in one little part of a paragraph in the real book. The real book is about a boy who has a heart of wood, very similar to a heart of stone, that needs transformation so that he can become a real boy through the work of the good fairy, the blue fairy, who is the Christ figure in the book, who brings him finally to love others more than he loves himself. That's what the real story is about. At the end of the book, you see him rescue his father from a shark that's eaten him. So you see elements of, biblical imagery in there, and the transformation of the boy is really one much more biblical than what Disney was able to provide us. So we see those things in fables all the time. Read the great children's novels to your young children from the 19th century and don't let them watch the Disney versions of them. I think Lewis talks a little bit about the moral imagination when he talks about how imagination is fostered through myth. And he's talking a little bit about Oedipus Rex. I'm sure many of you've read or know of this book, but of course the story in Oedipus Rex is there's a prophecy that he will kill his father and marry his mother. And this is what Lewis says about those kinds of stories and how they can affect the moral imagination of our children. We've just had set before our imagination something that's always baffled the intellect. We've seen how destiny and free will can be combined, even how free will is the modus operandi of destiny. Of course, what he refers to earlier in this is that in the story, the way that that's made possible is his father, in order to prevent this from happening, sends him in to be killed, and then he ends up in exile, so he doesn't know who his father and mother are, which makes it possible for this to come about. Well, it's hard to imagine that as an intellectual proposition, but in the story, you can see it. The story does what no theorem can quite do. It may not be like real life in the superficial sense, but it sets before us an image of what reality may well be like at some more central region. So that's how Lewis describes the power of myth to establish your moral imagination. So the second thing that you can do, I'm going to tie this into junior high, because I think for parents, junior high is that rough time where the kids are adolescents and they have friends and you're trying to compete with the friends and the school's doing its training. For this, I'm going to go to the concept of the paideagog, which comes from the word paideia. And in Ephesians 6, when we see Paul call fathers to educate their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, before that he says, don't provoke them to anger, which is a really odd kind of phrase to be in there. It's there because at that time, the practice was for Greeks mostly, to Greek citizens or Roman citizens, to hire some tutor, usually a slave, sometimes a tutor, who would follow the kid around everywhere and make sure that he lived or he developed a paideia that was consistent with the family. Now, we don't do that anymore because too much is delegated to, I think, the school, to the sports teams, to things outside our families. And so what I'm calling, having worked in a school for 10, 12 years, the school can take a very small portion of the job. The big job is with parents. And you can see that in the fact that, as I said, there's 16,000 hours in school. They spend about 90,000 hours before they're 18 years old outside of school. So what you do as parents with them and how much focus and attention you put on them, the 3 suggestions I have is keep them away from the technology. Dads, put your sons to work, find work that they can do and work alongside them, and put the time into driving what they do as opposed to letting them, the sports teams or the outside forces drive what your kids are doing. So I know from a school guy that's an odd thing to say, but I've seen it long enough to know we aren't going to win this battle if the parents aren't deeply involved, especially in the middle school years with the kids. The last one I want to talk about, and we'll wrap up here, is rhetoric. Now, rhetoric is interesting. My view of rhetoric is that everything that Christ touches gets a lot bigger. Anytime Christ touched something, it got bigger. The law got reduced to love your neighbor and love yourself. It's about love. But that made it huge, right? That means it matters to everything. The kingdom of God is so much more important and massive than any city of God or city of man on earth, because Christ magnifies everything, grace over law. So when we look at rhetoric, I think we see the same thing happen. Rhetoric in the Roman sense was largely a legal argument, but they got it from classical rhetoric, Cicero, how do you argue legal points? The Greeks who gave it to the Romans saw it more as an ethical tool where they sought truth based on ethics. What I want to encourage you to do with regard to rhetoric in your context is to see it as what Doug was talking about earlier today, everything in the cosmos coming together in Christ. That's what rhetoric really is. It's the bringing together of everything in Christ. And we see this, it was given to us most notably by Anselm of Canterbury in the 12th century, where the first thing that we know about Anselm usually is his famous saying, I do not try, Lord, to attain your lofty heights, because my understanding is no way equal to it. But I do desire to understand your truth a little, and that truth that my heart believes and loves, I do not seek to understand that I may believe. Now this is the key part of it. I do not seek to understand your truth so that I may believe it, but I believe so that I may understand. For I believe this also, that unless I believe, I shall not understand. So Anselm took rhetoric and Christianized it by flipping it on its head and saying, it begins with a fear of the Lord. And if you look at rhetoric, a friend of mine once told me, grammar aligns pretty closely with knowledge in Scripture, logic with understanding, and rhetoric with wisdom. So what Anselm is arguing for here is the development of wisdom in children and in students through first knowing that God is the beginning of all, or the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all knowledge. And then Anselm brings in great books and the dialectic. The dialectic is a form of teaching where there's discussion between teachers. We think of it today as great books instruction, but I believe that's part of rhetoric, is this dialogue that needs to occur in what Adler called the great conversation through all of history and time. But the end, or the telos of what's going on in our schools, needs to be very different than that of secular charter schools who claim to be classical, or other schools that are classical. What they cannot do without Christ is they cannot unify that wisdom into a comprehensive cosmology. There's no way they can get it together, because there's no principle that can follow all the way through without Christ. So that's I don't have enough time to really elaborate more on that, but it's the way I would like you to see the high school education, or the rhetoric school education of your children, is the coalescing of their understanding of everything into a system of truth with Christ at the center. That's really what rhetoric is for the Christian. So with that, I'll conclude here. Rhetoric was, after Anselm changed the way the church viewed education, we moved into what's called the scholastic era. And and at that time, rhetoric was no longer merely a means of political persuasion, nor was it a tool to parse ethical truth, goodness, and beauty. Instead, rhetoric was a means by which we systematize, order, and understand everything we encounter in God's cosmos. And it's based on a foundation of God's revealed word. Anselm's contribution in rhetoric gave birth to the scholastic age, as I just said, and Christian rhetoric, built on the fear of the Lord, became the replacement for Ciceronian rhetoric or Greek rhetoric. So with those three aspects, the moral imagination, being the paideagog to your children, and raising them in the wisdom of the Lord through the rhetorical training of classical education, we can launch the insurgency that needs to happen in order for us to counteract 100 years of progressives taking over our children and their minds and their hearts. So thank you, and there's your challenge.